Welcome to Nobody Told Me.
I'm Jan Black.
And I'm Laura Owens. We're excited to talk with psychologist Michael Reichert on this episode. Michael is the founding director of the Center for the Study of Boys and Girls' Lives at the University of Pennsylvania.
And Michael has been described as a leading researcher of the journey from boyhood to manhood. He's the author of a new book on that topic called How to Raise a Boy: The Power of Connection to Raise Good Men. Michael, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Jan. Hi, Laura. Glad to be with you and your listeners.
Why did you feel compelled to write How to Raise a Boy?
Yeah, it really is the convergence of my personal journey as a man, a father, and now a grandfather to a grandson, my professional work, and my commitment to social justice. I think that it is high time we were honest with ourselves about the boyhood that we've built and maintain, which was never designed particularly well for boys' well-being. And, I think in these times when we're all quite thrilled with the progress of women and girls and wondering what to do about boys, it seems like we're questioning masculinity itself instead of looking at the architecture of boyhood, the kind of conditioning of boys that we continue to perpetuate despite the fact that there have always been routine losses and casualties. So I guess the answer to your question, short answer to your question is, I just think it's high time we applied a rigorous lens to how we are helping boys in our nurture of them.
How has boyhood changed from my mom's generation and from your generation to mine?
Yeah, it's a great question. I actually think that the gender equality movement has disrupted the sort of easy transmission of masculine norms from one generation to the next. The reproduction of traditional masculinity has been disrupted. But despite that fact, most boys will tell you in surveys that they hear messages from both their mothers and their fathers that they should man up, that they should be ready to fight, that they should suck up their emotions and their pain and keep it to themselves. So, while I think that the progress of women and girls has disrupted sort of the prerogatives and the privileges of masculinity that were historically true for generations, I think that's less true today. It's still true, despite that boys are being socialized in many of the same traditional virtues of values. So that's problematic. And I think that what we're seeing is new generations of boys and men trying to adapt to very, very changed gender landscape. And there's sort of a reinvention of what it means to be a man going on, but in fits and starts, I think.
So what is wrong with telling a boy to man up or to try harder or those things that you were talking about just a minute ago?
Yeah, it's sort of a paradox, right? We don't want to turn boys into snowflakes. We like certain things about the traditional values of masculinity, like, that men are self-sacrificing, that they are willing to be strong, that they're willing to be responsible. They like to build things and make things and care for things. We like many traditional values associated with traditional masculinity. But I think that one of the main thrusts of traditional masculinity has run very counter to, in fact, in violation of boys' human natures. And in particular, this idea that it somehow weakens you if you admit vulnerability, show your emotions, allow yourself to be scared, stay close to people, even as you grow into manhood, and maintain a healthy interdependence with people. I think those human qualities get compromised when the messages are suck it up and keep it to yourself and be strong, be ready to fight, don't be afraid. So I think that what we need to do is recognize that, as one research put it, every human being is wired to connect. Our brains are built to be in relationship. And one of the things we need to do with our emotional struggles is lean into those relationships and get things off our chest with someone we trust and talk it out, code feelings with language, things like that. And that is not part of the standard curriculum for boyhood, for how we condition our sons.
What are schools doing wrong? I know the implication that I've gotten from what you've said is this is kind of the responsibility of the parents, but I feel like the schools spend so much time with sons and that they should have some role in this.
No, you're absolutely right. Some of my research was to ascertain we're in the midst of sort of shining a light on the phenomenon of boys' underachievement educationally. You know, there's cries of a new crisis, a boyhood crisis, of boys falling behind. Titles of books like The Trouble with Boys or The Demise of Guys or so forth. And a lot of that centers on boys' educational progress relative to girls. The truth is, first off, there's nothing new about this. Girls have outperformed boys academically since 1900. The kinds of losses, educational losses, that typify education for many boys, that those losses are harder and harder to bear. You know, not getting a good education, not getting through high school, not getting into college, not getting through college, those outcomes are more and more consequential. So I undertook a study, a global study, several studies actually, the first one in 18 schools in 6 different countries, and the second in 36 schools in 6 different countries, and about 1,500 adolescent boys and about 1,000 of their teachers. And I essentially asked, what's working? And what we found in that first study was boys telling us that what worked for them, what made learning work for them, was a positive relationship, a connection with a teacher or a coach. And in the second study, what we did is we dug into that finding and tried to map what kinds of relationships work and what kinds of relationships don't work and what can schools do about that. Anyway, I'm telling you this story to make the point that the surprise of the first study was for boys so self-consciously to identify themselves as relational learners. You know, the stereotype of the boy is that he doesn't care about relationships, that he's independent and strong and, you know, does what he has to do. And what we found was most all boys have some kind of relational breakdown with a teacher or a coach. When they have that breakdown, they're very unlikely to repair the breakdown themselves, to take initiative.
Interesting.
And more importantly, what they will do instead of trying to repair the breakdown is simply check out, give up, walk away, disrupt, become oppositional, take a pass, fail. I had one boy tell a story at a school. We were doing a focus group with boys that had been identified as particular problems. And one boy, I asked the group, you know, tell us a story about a relationship that hadn't gone well. And this one boy told a story about a teacher. He was still in that class. The boy had come to school one day. School has a uniform dress code and a white shirt. He was wearing his white shirt, but under the white shirt, he was wearing a concert T-shirt that actually could be seen through the white shirt.
Uh-huh.
And the teacher called him out on that. In the class, he and the boy began to argue. The teacher said, how about if we just go out in the hallway? Out in the hallway with the door closed, the argument got more heated, and the teacher ultimately called him a punk, or something like, stop acting like such a punk, or you're acting like such a punk. It was months after that altercation in the hallway, and what that boy said to us was, I won't learn from him.
Huh.
I said to the boy, but you're still in his class, right? You're still, you know, learning from him, taking tests with him, getting a grade from him. And he said, I don't care. I'm not doing anything for him. I won't learn from him.
You know, that's so interesting because I always think with boys that things like that, comments like that just roll off their shoulders. Whereas for me, that would bother me months later. I could see how that would affect me, but I would probably just try harder. I certainly wouldn't check out, but it's just interesting to see the differences between the genders.
Yeah, if you compare this finding about what happens if boys don't find a connection with a teacher or a coach, how they don't try as hard, how they give up, or how they dig their heels in and simply balk, and you compare that to girls, I think what we see is that girls persist where boys are more fragile, more vulnerable to the quality of the relationship.
Interesting.
I'm not saying that relationships don't matter with girls, but I think I'm saying that for whatever reason, developmental reasons, girls persist where boys are much more likely to give up.
One of the things I found interesting in your book is where you urge parents to hang in there and keep calm when a son is criticizing or blaming or rejecting them. Why is that important?
Yeah. So, if I can extrapolate from that study with respect to learning and just simply make the point that I think that from my clinical work, my own experience as a parent, and just research in general about boys' development, the field of boyhood studies, I think what we can safely say is not only are boys relational learners, but boys are relationally dependent, period, like all other human beings, all other kinds of human beings. And what that means is that when they're having an emotional difficulty, if they're encountering some kind of peer pressure, and most boys are, or some sort of setback on the field in their sport, or some rejection with a romantic interest, what they need to do is they need to talk through, get those upset feelings off their chest. That's actually how our brains are built. We don't hold upset feelings in well. We don't tolerate that well. Our minds become echo chambers, and the fears or the anger or the dejection and disappointment, it amplifies. What we need to do is we need to find someone we can talk to. And, if the boy is sort of dramatizing his upset in his behavior, he's acting surly or angry or difficult in some way or other, targeting the parent. It's not that the parent should make their own feelings of rejection the priority in that moment, or that they can expect to reason the boy out of those feelings. Somehow, argue him into being more respectful or being more vulnerable. The boy has to work his way through the way he's gotten jammed up, and he's trying intuitively to do that by showing how upset he is, how angry he is. And the parent, as listener's job in that space, is to simply offer what we call a holding environment. Be present, stay connected, don't take it personal, and let the boy work it through. If he pushes you away, hang in. And that's the kind of work I do in my clinical practice, coaching parents to recognize the incredible power we have, even with boys that we feel like we've lost, who have gone, way over to the peer group and cut themselves off from us. The power of connection, that's the point of the title of the book. The power of connection is a force that's undeniable, built into our human natures, boys, girls, all of us.
So then how can parents win back their boys once they've started to engage in those kinds of behaviors?
Yeah, typically what I would say is that that's a symptom of a disconnection that has become established in the relationship, and the first order of business is for the parent to reestablish a connection. And the way to go about that is on the boy's terms, to simply show up in the boy's life, to sit down with him when he's watching a TV show, or ask him if you can play when he's at the video game console, or ask him if he wants to shoot some baskets, or have a pillow fight with him, unsolicited, just throw a pillow at him. Be playful, something that reaches for him on terms that he can actually inhabit without in some way or other giving up his own position and surrender to the parent's needs in that moment. What too many parents do, I think, is they try to reason their son back into connection, where to the boy, what that looks like is the parent trying to essentially persuade the boy that he's wrong, they're right, he should give up his position and agree to theirs. And, particularly for boys in adolescence, with that really strong sense of justice, that feels unfair. So, I think the first order of business is to reestablish connection, and then simply to offer the boy, and I describe in the book different tools that parents can use there. The most important tool being simply to listen, to pay attention. We don't do that well typically anyway. we tend to come to our children with minds that are fraught with, worry or an agenda of our own, and finding some way to put that agenda aside and simply pay attention to the boy, notice how much we love him and delight in him, and show it. Let our hearts just radiate to him that he is a delight to us, and that whatever arguments or disagreements or worries we've harbored, to put those aside so the boy gets a real pure sense of who he is in our eyes. Offering that kind of regard is the best way to reestablish a connection.
What specific advice would you have for mothers of sons, and what specific advice would you have for fathers of sons? Would it be the same?
Yeah. No, it's different. It's different. I think the general objective is the same, which is connection through these strategies of listening and special time and so forth. But I think that the barriers that parents have to overcome within ourselves are very gendered. I think, for example, most mothers, research shows, get the message more or less profoundly that boys are an alien species and that the mother, doesn't have much to offer him after a certain age, that there's a mysterious sort of fraternity that the boy is about to be inducted into, and the mother's role is simply to step aside and let the boy enter the world of men that she knows nothing about. And in fact, if she tried to hold on to him, might somehow ruin his entry into that world. The mama's boy myth, the myth that if a boy remains too close to his mother, it'll somehow foster an overdependence or a feminization of him. And the research about that is powerful. And yet, when I speak to audiences of mothers and fathers, there are still many mothers, particularly single mothers, who worry that they're not enough and that they don't know what they're doing. So I think mothers have those hurdles to overcome. Much of, I think, my job is simply to say, you are so important to him. You are his holding environment. You are his attachment figure. He feels you in the most basic parts of his being. And to the degree that you can stay aligned with him and open-hearted with him, he's going to be stronger and better able to resist the challenges ahead. So for fathers, it's in some ways the opposite. Many of us dads feel like we have important lessons to teach our son. And there's a whole lore about teaching boys to be men by passing along sort of the insider tricks of the trade. And the problem with that is that we wind up kind of reproducing one generation to the next the prejudices of traditional masculinity. And, without recognizing really, and this is the problem for we adults in general, we just don't recognize how much things have changed. And my whole thrust is to recognize that every generation faces a new set of challenges, a new world, a new set of opportunities. And what we want is for our children to be in the position to read the opportunities and the challenges in front of them and have the creativity and grit to respond in appropriate ways. We have a job to do. We parents have a job to do, but it's not to tell our sons what to think or what to do. It's to help them make good decisions by strengthening their core values and their connections and their sense of self so that they, are able to resist the kind of conventional pressures in a hookup culture, for example, or the peer pressures of unfortunate and unwise risk-taking. And they're more likely to do that if they have the backing and the active sense in their hearts and their minds that they're with their parents, they're connected with their parents, and they're accountable to their parents.
I was talking with my friends last night about how we have dated guys who've had really good parents and mothers that have raised really great daughters, but they've raised these boys who have turned out to, for lack of a better word, just be assholes. And I'm wondering, what have they done wrong? What could they be doing differently?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that the pull of the brotherhood, of the lower common denominator male peer culture is powerful. We find in research, for example, that even boys as young as 4 years old, 5 years old, are pulled by that culture. It actually is a matter of their survival to be part of the male peer group. And that peer group has a set of values and norms that run counter to most parents' values. What I argue is that what parents can do in relation to that cultural pull is strengthen boys' resistance so that they're actually able to hold on to their hearts, hold on to themselves. And they're going to do that because they're anchored in relationships that matter to them. They've got their parents, in a certain sense, in their hip pockets. Their parents go with them in the back of their minds. You know, the boy who at a party as a freshman, is offered a bong or offered a beer and hears his parents' voice in the back of his head and has second thoughts about how easily he agrees to do things that he might not want to do but feels pressured to do.
Uh-huh.
So I guess what I'm saying to you is that to those moms, the first thing I would do is acknowledge that they're up against a tough challenge, but that they have this force, this weapon. And unfortunately, many parents, moms in particular, underestimate the power they have. And in the face of a boy who becomes rejecting or withdrawn, a parent's own maybe internal uncertainty or lack of self-confidence, the parent sort of gives the boy over to the peer culture and abdicates their responsibility to hold the boy accountable in the relationship as a way of really providing strong moral guidance. What I would say to that mom is first, acknowledge how hard it is, and second, say, nonetheless, she has the power that it takes, and she has an obligation to exercise it. Go to the mats. Wrestle that boy back.
And how do you do that if there is a troubling situation that's cropped up, if the son is getting bad grades, if he's getting into trouble with alcohol or drugs or anger or violence? How do you get him back?
Yeah, and unfortunately, many boys, many families will face those kinds of challenges. And the role of, I mentioned listening and I mentioned special time. The third tool I recommend that parents become masters of is the tool of setting limits with boys. Too often we think of discipline as a matter of domination, of control, or of punishment. And, those are tools that you bring into play, I think, in the last instance, only sort of out of desperation when all else has failed and the boy is headed for serious trouble. Short of that, what we're looking for is for the boy to develop self-direction and self-control. And the way for him to do that isn't to have parents substitute their control for his own, but it's rather to help the boy develop those skills, if you will. And the way that the boy can do that is in this model that I call listen, limit, listen. And that's a process for understanding what's going on that's driving the boy off course, setting a limit with the boy saying, I'm sorry, you can't mistreat your sister right now, or I'm not going to let you go out with that group of your friends, or you can't bomb the test, and I'm not going to let you underperform in school, whatever it might be. Setting the limit, and then simply standing your ground. And what happens then is that the boy's upsets, the kind of trouble in his heart that's driving the misbehavior wells up and typically comes out. It might first come out in a fury or a rage or a meltdown, and parents need to be prepared for that. But, working that through is how the parent can help the boy recover his own mind, his own judgment, and restore the connection with the parent. The boy can see the parent in that context as a resource and someone who's on his side, who isn't going to let him stray away and misbehave, get lost in some set of peer group norms that aren't really his values. So it's basically, in my mind, calling the boy back into relationship and into accountability.
And Michael, as you know, our show is called Nobody Told Me, and we always ask our guests one last question. And that is, what is your nobody told me lesson? So what is one piece of advice that you wish you'd known about raising a boy or experiencing boyhood in general that would have made your life a lot easier?
You know, I think that we live in a time where there are still popular myths about what it means to be male. We still believe, for example, that biology is destiny when it comes to being male, that our hormones drive us. We're essentially feral creatures dominated by our hormones and prone to violence and sexual predation, disconnection, and so forth. And none of that is true. And I wish that someone had told me more clearly. I wish we can amplify that message everywhere, that boys have human hearts and human needs, and that those needs are hardwired parts of human nature, and that we violate those human features at our peril, both individually and collectively as a society. That would be my nobody told me moment.
And one other question we ask, how can people connect with you on the internet and on social media?
Well, I have a website, Michael C. Reichert, and I think that's the easiest way to reach me.
Okay, great. Well, our thanks to Michael Reichert, author of How to Raise a Boy, The Power of Connection to Raise Good Men. And again, as he mentioned, his website is michaelcreichert.com. I'm Laura Owens.
And I'm Jan Black.
And you've been listening to Nobody Told Me. Thanks so much for joining us.